You can't. It's like
Yeah,
what I do is I put. We're going to begin in about a minute and a half. So get your donuts and coffee and make your way up front. Welcome, everyone. So good to have such a full room on such a treacherous morning. If those of you who are getting coffee and donuts want to join us up front, you're welcome. There's plenty of seats, a whole row of seats in the front, almost on both sides. So please make your way up here. We're so grateful this morning to hear from Joe Crespino, who he and his family, Caroline and Carrie and Sam, were members of Holy Trinity for a long time before making the good decision to come here during COVID and have been active and beloved members since then. Joe is the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty and the Jimmy Carter Professor of History at Emory University. He is an expert in political and cultural history of the 20th century, and particularly the history of the American South since Reconstruction. He's written a number of books and academic journals, but he's also written for the New York Times and Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. We invited him to talk today about the topic which we either are very excited to hear about or not so excited to hear about, but here we are, faith and politics in a time of polarization, always important for us to wrap our minds around this, especially during this season. He's going to be drawing on his recent work, writing chapters for a Norton anthology on 20th and 21st century U.S. history. So, Joe, we're really grateful for you being here with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. It's great to be with you all. I have we're going to finish up about 5 till 11, and then I'll take questions. It's great to be with you all. Thank you for coming out on a snowy Sunday, and this is a delight for me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. This is not even on. Can you hear me better now? Or, okay, it's good. So anyway, it's great to be with you on a snowy Sunday. I want to tell you a little bit about kind of what I do and how I'm thinking about my faith and my citizenship and my job as an American historian in this in this time of transition, this interesting time in American history. Thanks so much, Jenny, for asking me to be here. It's really lovely. First, I want to talk about several things. One, I want to talk about President Carter's funeral this past week. I had the great pleasure of the great honor of being the Jimmy Carter Professor of American History at Emory. It's a great title, isn't it? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experiences with President Carter at Emory. I'm going to tell you about this textbook that I'm working on, which is interesting. I think has some interesting reflections for our moment. And then I want to also talk about this class on the 2024 election and polarization that I taught with an undergraduate this past fall, which also has, I think, some interesting insights for us. And then I want to close, and I love teaching Sunday school. I've never been a regular Sunday school teacher, but I've been a teacher for over, almost 27 years. And it's great to teach Sunday school because, when you teach college students, there's always, they're the age of my children. And I kind of want to talk to them like my children, and I can say things very directly to my children. And I feel like Sunday school is not like my college class. Sunday school, I come to you here today not as an expert in American history, although that's part of who I am, or even as a citizen, but I come to you as a fellow Christian, right? And so I want to think about faith and politics today with you, not only as an expert in American history, but as a Christian, as a fellow Christian, and how do we respond, and how do we think about in those terms? Okay, so first of all, what a week this has been, hasn't it? I just think that the whole series of remembrances of President Carter were a great gift to the country, right? And I think of it not just as a celebration of President Carter and his remarkable life, 100 years, but also just as a celebration of our democracy. And some of the most touching moments to me were, the congressional remembrance in the Capitol, where you had the two Republican leaders stand up. And it's important for, members of one party to say nice things about a deceased president of another party, right? And to find the common ground. Of course, I love seeing Barack Obama and Donald Trump, sharing a light moment of whatever they were talking about. Who knows what they were talking about? But that's good for the country too. And it was a great honor to be on Thursday afternoon. Fox 5 Atlanta asked me to come in and do like color commentary of when the body, when the casket returned to Plains, and then the service there in Maranatha, and the burial. And I've taken my class, so as the Carter chair, it's kind of weird how I became the Jimmy Carter chair. Basically, I'm a historian of modern American politics, and as a historian of modern American politics, when I got to Emory, one of the first things I wanted to do was develop this research seminar out of the Carter Presidential Archives, which are 1.5 miles away from Emory. And so for about 8 or 10 times, I taught this class on Jimmy Carter's America, where students would write these original research papers based out of the Carter Archives. So they would go in there and do all this research for the semester. And then, because President Carter is my colleague, a fellow professor at Emory, he would come to the final class. And so students would ask questions about their research and have this great kind of really oftentimes revealing exchange with President Carter. And sometimes you'd have students who would write on topics that President Carter has talked about for years and years, like, the decision to boycott the 1980 Olympics. But then sometimes students would do these papers, and President Carter hadn't thought about them in years. And you have this amazing exchanges. My favorite was this student who, when the class started, I didn't think much of him. In fact, I think he wore his pajama bottoms to class every day of the semester, except for the final class. He did put on pants when President Carter came. But he had just studied in Hungary the year before, and he wrote about the decision of the Carter administration to return the crown of St. Stephen to the Hungarian people. And this crown of St. Stephen is this relic of Hungarian Catholicism that in the aftermath of World War II, when the communists took over in Hungary, the Hungarian opposition gave it to the American army, and it was held in Fort Knox in Kentucky for all that time. And the decision in the late 1970s is whether do you give this to the Hungarian people to kind of encourage the reformers and encourage faith in an Eastern Bloc country. It was a part of the kind of soft power that President Carter tried to exert there late in the Cold War to try to encourage reform movements in Eastern Europe, which he was very successful in doing, and some things that we forget about when we think about President Carter's legacy as a foreign policy leader. Anyway, the kid said, well, President Carter was there, and he's like, well, I'm writing on the decision to return the crown to St. Stephen. He kind of mumbled it out because he really couldn't tell from the archival record whether President Carter was involved with this or not, or whether it was kind of like a second level State Department decision. But President Carter was like, really? You're writing about that? And then he told these amazing stories about how he was directly involved in that decision and how difficult the decision was, given ongoing, tensions and raging the Cold War. And then afterwards, when he left the presidency, he went back for a parade in Budapest, and he was the Grand Marshal, and he kind of got misty-eyed talking about how important that was to him personally to kind of promote religious faith in this country that had been starved of it for decades, under communist rule. So that was just amazing. And so it was really poignant this week. And I think it was a great celebration that in this time of polarization, in this time of political transition, that we can still come together and remember a remarkable American, a remarkable American and a remarkable citizen of the world. And I think that's how President Carter will be remembered. So I'm teaching this, I'm writing this textbook for W.W. Norton. It was originally written, I actually used this textbook when I was a junior at the Macaulay School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This was my U.S. history textbook. And it was originally written by George Tyndall, the University of North Carolina. Do we have any North Carolina graduates? Yeah. You take a class with George Tyndall? But you knew who he is. Of course. He was a very famous historian at Chapel Hill for many years. And then David Shai. Do we have any Furman graduates? No? David Shai was the president at Furman for many years. He took it over for George Tyndall, and now I guess it's in its third generation, and I'm one of the co-authors. There are two other co-authors that are coming on. But I write the chapters for the 20th and I write the textbook chapters for the 20th and 21st century. And it's kind of strange for me to get my head around that still, but there's 21st century history that we're writing about now. And this textbook has the tradition of finishing with what happened. It's going to be published later this year. I think it's coming out in the summer of 2025. But it goes through what happened last week, basically, And so it covered, and so they wanted me to write about the 2024 election and also the results of the 2024 election. This is not an easy thing to do, right? It's not, it's always a challenge for historians when you're writing the recent past, because as historians, you're trying to find this dispassionate historical perspective, right? You're trying to gain distance from the events of the day to try to bring if journalists write the first draft of history, that's a kind of truism that we talk about, journalists writing the first draft of history. Well, how do you write the second draft of the 2024 election? That was my challenge. And I don't think I've done it very well. Because if you look at this textbook, one of the things that happens whenever you get in textbooks, you get closer to the present, and the kind of broader themes of history, the social history, the cultural trends, the technological transformations that always transform social and cultural and political life, those kind of recede, and you just get to a kind of recitation of current events. right? And oftentimes it's what happened in this election and then this election and that kind of thing. And so one of the challenges I had in writing this last chapter was to try to think at what are the broader trends or themes that have transformed American life in the last 30 years, or the last 25 years, thinking about the 21st century. Because there's one chapter, the final chapter, 30, that deals with, American history since 9/11, basically. And so the two themes that I've kind of highlighted in this final chapter are really, I present them to you here today because I think there are themes that can help us situate ourselves in the current political moment by trying to think dispassionately, trying to, kind of step back and look at ourselves here in this present political moment. But the two themes won't be surprising to you. They're polarization, the increasing rise of polarization in American politics, and also technological transformation. And of course, those are very closely related. But if you think about the level, people ask me regularly about the levels of partisanship and polarization today. Have we ever been this divided before? And I always say, yes, we have. There was that war in the middle of the 19th century where almost 700,000 Americans were killed, right? So we have been polarized before. We have been heavily divided. It's not unprecedented. But of course, that's not a history we want to relive, is it? And so history is not always a great guide. But there is something comforting about the idea that we have been polarized before. We have been very polarized before. But you can, it's clear that you can kind of look historically about the changes in American life and politics that have given rise to the high levels of polarization. And they are very high levels of polarization, And if I were going to give you, if I had, longer, I could give you the whole lecture on the history of contemporary polarization and partisanship. And it would deal with things like, the collapse of the party structures, party strength that were fed by, campaign finance laws. It would talk about technology, the transformative impact that cable television, the internet, social media has had. It would also talk about things that sociologists talk a lot about, which is with rising educational levels in post-World War II America, people are much more mobile in the way they pursue their careers. And so that people are moving a lot more since the 1950s and 60s. And when they move, they tend to move to neighborhoods and areas where people think a lot like them, right? I live in Decatur, right? It's the Democratic Republic of Decatur, right? It is this incredible, liberal blue little bubble in the larger red or purple state of Georgia. And this is happening everywhere, right? This is not just happening in Atlanta. But we all know where the conservative, the northern arc or the Republican areas, we know where the blue areas are. But it's every metropolitan place around the country. And it's all around the country, right? Is that we're so less likely today to live on a street where someone puts up a political sign that's different from the candidate that you're voting for, right? That is just so uncommon. It's also less common. I'm sure that All Saints is more politically homogenous today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, right? All of our institutions are politically homogenous in ways that they weren't. So the big sort, this was the title of a book that came out by a journalist about 20 years ago now. But it's a really great book. Bill Bishop is his name. And it synthesizes a lot of this work that's been done by sociologists and political scientists about how we're sorting ourselves geographically. But then, again, it was 20 years ago. It was before the rise of social media. And you think about the ways we are literally sorting ourselves into, geographically in our neighborhoods and those kinds of things. But think how much more that has accelerated in the last 20 years with the virtual lives that we lead now, right? Where there are algorithms that are absolutely sorting us and presenting and putting us in communities where we're only interacting with people who think like we do, right? And who like the same things that we like, literally, who hit the like button on the same things that we like, right? And who are inflamed by and enraged by the same things that inflame and enrage us. So that big sort is happening now in ways that we don't fully recognize. So the technological, that kind of technological revolution that's happened that we're living through. I mean, I think it's really legitimate to think about it as not just about social media, but when you think about things like artificial intelligence and other changes, and we could really think about this moment that we're living through as the digital revolution. And there hasn't been a lot of talk about this, but I think it's really an interesting thought to think about how transformative the Industrial Revolution was of the late 19th century. The way it disoriented people, culturally, politically, how disruptive it was in all kinds of ways, and all the political movements. Marxism grows out of the Industrial Revolution. Socialism and communism, and the kind of conflicts that would seed for the next century, the kind of geopolitical world that we lived in, all came out of technological revolutions around industrialization. And so, we are living through a kind of digital revolution that is absolutely every bit as disorienting and disruptive as that earlier technological revolution. And so, I think that's very important, and I try to register that in this textbook, and I try to in hopes that students can be more mindful that these things aren't just normal. And this here again, I put on my hat as a parent, and I try to tell my children, the way that you have grown up, politics have not been normal. The world we're living in is going through tremendous upheaval and tremendous change, and it's very hard for children who are growing up in it. Right, and we know this. And so if you want to think about in religious terms, who are the prophetic voices right now about the digital revolution and how it's transforming our lives? One of the most important for me is Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist at New York University, who has written so much about polarization and division, and also the influence of a phone-based childhood and the way it's giving rise to anxiety among young people. He's someone I read a lot and find, and so I actually have an excerpt from one of Haidt's. We bring in primary sources into this textbook, and so one of the primary sources. I have two primary sources for this chapter 30. The first primary source is the Dobbs versus decision about abortion, and we read an excerpt from that. And the second primary source is an excerpt from an article that Jonathan Haidt wrote in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, and the subtitle is "Why the Last 10 Years Have Been So Uniquely Stupid." And he talks about the introduction of the like and share buttons in social media, and he registers that as a transformative moment in the history of social media and the history of media, because of the way that it transforms a kind of static web page, which is what kind of Facebook was before, and the way it turned social media into a kind of video game, right? Where, like, in Twitter was like this, certainly, and I'm off Twitter now, but part of the goal of Twitter is just to forward things and share things and like things and have more people like the things that you like, and it becomes and you kind of your status goes up. And of course, the things that we share are the things that outrage. Typically, most often, they're the things that outrage us the most. And so, literally, social media is this kind of engine of division, of polarization, of anger, and all of those things. So, those are the things that I'm trying to, highlight and bring to the fore in this textbook that I'm writing. I taught this class in the fall with this undergraduate. Emory has this program where undergraduates can propose a class, and it's like a 1-hour class. It meets for an hour on Fridays at noon, and they get a professor to teach it with them. But really, this undergraduate, this guy Noah Stifelman, who's a sophomore, from New Jersey. And he was in a freshman seminar of mine, and he wanted to learn more and think more about polarization and partisanship. And so he read a lot over the summer, and then we did this class together. But I told Noah going in, it's like, look, and so we met once a week to talk about the election and talk about polarization. And I said, Noah, I'll do this, but we can't just have everybody, preaching to the choir. We can't just have a bunch of, Democrats or liberal students, all these folks who are going to vote for Kamala Harris. You need to go out and recruit some conservative students so we have an interesting conversation. Well, that was hard to do at Emory. It's like, so for the first 4 or 5 weeks, we had no conservative students. And I was like, Noah, this is not working. You got to work harder. Well, it turns out the college Republicans, and again, it speaks to this issue about the homogeneity of our institutions that we're all a part of. And this is not just, I don't just blame the left on this. The rights, their institutions are homogenous too, right? We're all polarized and we're all in our bubbles. So I told, Noah, you have to work on this. You have to get to work on this. So I got to work on it too. So the Emory's Young Republicans had actually dissolved a couple of years ago because there was nobody there who wanted to be. And actually, it wasn't just that there were no conservative students, and I have empathy for these students. It's like they were students who ultimately wanted to apply for jobs in big law firms or on Wall Street. And in an era of the Trump Republican Party, they didn't want it on their resume that they were a young Republican, right? That would not help them when they were on the job market. That's what several of them told me this. And so it was a very, kind of astute, strategic move on their part. But anyway, the Emory's Young Republicans were reestablished this fall by a Chinese national student who was a freshman. He's from China. He's not even a citizen, but he's the one who restarted the Young Republicans. And he's gotten you hear that. And there's an article in the Emory Wheel about it. It's like, is this guy a plant? What's going on here? Somebody's paying him to do something I don't know what's going on. So, but he's not a plant. In fact, he was over at our house on election night. The whole class came over, and we watched the election together. We ended up getting about 3 or 4 conservative students in the class, and we had some great discussions. And they came over to our house on election night, and we watched CNN for a little while, and we watched Fox for a little while, and we watched MSNBC for a little while. And the only thing we could all agree on was that Steve Kornacki was the best one at the big board. He does that the best of anybody, But it was great, and it was great for me to interact with these students and to have the discussions that we had. And I think everybody really learned a lot from it. The Chinese national student had what I think is by far the best explanation of Trump's economic policies of anybody I've heard on television or anything. So he's a really smart young student. But that was a great experience. And another experience I had this fall that I thought was interesting was the day after the election, my colleague Robert Franklin, who's a former president of Morehouse College, who teaches at the Candler School of Theology, he asked me, this is one of the great honors of my career, to be on a panel the day after the election with Andrew Young. Wow, wasn't that fun? That was amazing. And so Ambassador Young and I were there with Robert Franklin and my colleague Andra Gillespie, who's a political scientist. And we were reflecting on the election. And one of the things that I wanted to do in my remarks were, I just wanted to thank, I'm from Mississippi. My mother's side of the family has lived in Mississippi since the 1830s. And my father's from Mississippi too. They met at Ole Miss in the early 1960s. And they graduated the year before James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi. My dad played football there. He was a football hero and went on to play in the NFL. But when he left the NFL, they moved back to Macon, Mississippi, the small little town that I'm from. And so I grew up in the 70s and 80s in a time when the legacies of Jim Crow segregation were still very real and very vivid. I went to an all-white private school that had been a segregation academy established to avoid public school desegregation for the first 8 years of my schooling. It's not because my parents were some great ideological segregationists. It's just they moved back and that's where they that's where all the white kids went and all the black kids went over here. And that's what it was like growing up in Mississippi in the 1970s and 80s. So I told Andrew Young, I said, Ambassador Young, and I told the class, it's like, because in the aftermath, the day after the election, you know, the great fear, right, is that Trump is an authoritarian, that Trump is a fascist, and that and of course the Democrats were arguing all throughout the campaign, do not vote, you know, vote for democracy, don't vote for fascism. And so one of the things I told the crowd was like, you know, it's true, you know, one of the things we should remember is that America, it's not like there hasn't been authoritarianism in American history. We had, that's a great description of what existed in Mississippi in the 1950s, is racism or racial authoritarianism. The state of Mississippi had a Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which is like a state-level FBI, to literally police the color line, to spy on civil rights activists, and to spy on white folks who went to church groups that talked about loving your neighbor, you know, and things like that. And those files are all on the web, and you can look at them. And so I just thanked Ambassador Young for his work with the SCLC and going into a state like Mississippi and in confronting the forces of racial authoritarianism that are part of American history. And I was glad to be able to do that publicly. And, you know, of course, the whole room stood up and applauded Andrew Young. Ambassador Young had a really interesting, you know, take on the election. He was in his way, you know, in his kind of genial, kind of somewhat, you know, he met Donald Trump. He thought Donald Trump was awful. But he also, you know, kind of had a realistic sensibility of like, you know, it's just time to get to work and continue to do the things that people need to be doing. And my reaction in that session is one that I continue to have, is that it's just the returns on the election. And look, I'm a Democrat, let's be honest. I mean, I'm a tenured professor at an elite private university. Of course I'm a Democrat. And so, you know, on my text feeds with my friends before the election, you know, everybody was really optimistic about Kamala Harris winning, and I wasn't. It's not like I'm some great political seer or anything, but I thought it was going to be really, really close, and that he might win the Electoral College. But it was really surprising to me, as a quote unquote expert, that Donald Trump won the popular vote, right? And it just made me feel like I'm in such a bubble. You know, I am in such a bubble, and I'm only getting the news that's feeding my own prejudices. And so that was one of the things that that made me kind of realize how isolated I am. Another interesting article that came out, and I'll just tell you this briefly, because it was another kind of aha moment for me, and kind of revealing what kind of bubble I live in, is an article that came out shortly after the election in the New York Times that talked about the number of immigrants who came into the country during the first 3 years of the Biden administration. It was a huge amount. It was a historic amount because it pushed the number of foreign-born residents of the United States over the 15% mark. Now, I've taught American history, as I said, for 27 years. I've taught it at Emory for 22 years. But like when I give the lecture on the history of immigration, you know, the three great waves, the first great wave in the 1850s, second great wave around the turn of the 20th century, we're living through the third great wave since the 1990s. But the highest percentage of foreign-born population historically was always 14.9%. That was measured in the 1910 census. And you think about what happened in the 19-teens and the 1920s. That was a period of intense political reaction against immigration, right? Because of the size of the immigration that had been coming into the country for the previous 3 decades. And so in the 19-teens, you had the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which was not just a racist organization in the 1920s. It was also fueled heavily by anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Catholic sentiment too. You also had famously in the 1920s, the 1924 Immigration Act, which established an explicitly racist hierarchy for a quota system for where immigrants could come into the country. And that racist quota system existed from 1924 until 1965, when you had an Immigration Act passed by Lyndon Johnson that got rid of it, right? And it's really a horrible, period in American history. If you think about that, how long that racist immigration system existed in our country. So these are all. So it was a kind of aha moment for me to realize, oh, I'm living through a historic period in American history. And the political reaction that exists in this country right now around immigration is part of a broader pattern. We've been here before. Again, it's helpful sometimes in history to think about, is this unprecedented? It's not unprecedented. We've been here before, and when a country has this level of immigration coming in, it's going to provoke political reaction. We should not be surprised by it. Right? So that was another kind of realization for me about kind of where we think about where the country is historically. And I can tell you, in 3 years when I revise this textbook again, I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about the levels of immigration right now in a historical perspective as a way of trying to understand how salient and how large the issue of immigration is in our politics right now. I've got 2 minutes, but let me close here with a couple of gratuitous reflections on living in polarized times as a Christian, not as an American historian, not as an engaged citizen, but as someone who just this morning reread the Beatitudes. And I think about the Beatitudes, and blessed are I was thinking about the Beatitudes a lot this last week. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God. My mother recited that to me in 1980 when she was going to vote for Jimmy Carter, and my dad wouldn't say who he'd vote for. And it was one of the first political discussions I remember at our family dinner table. And my mom was going to vote for Jimmy Carter because he was a peacemaker, and she was implying that my dad should too. Anyway, I reread the Beatitudes this week, but then I didn't realize all of that that sermon is all part of one sermon, right? Where he goes on to say, you have heard it said this, but I say to you this. And Jesus talks about the fulfillment of the law, that I have come not to reject the law, but to fulfill the law. And that's where, and of course that whole sermon ends with, therefore I say unto you, be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And I was thinking this week, I wonder what Jesus' tone of voice, I wonder what expression he had on his face when he was saying to the people, be perfect. Was he saying it like with a cold, icy glare, cold? I suspect he might have been saying it with a little bit of irony, knowing human nature as he did. Be perfect. Why not? Why not try to be perfect? Your heavenly Father is perfect. Life is a gift. Try to be perfect. I don't know. This is not my expertise. But I think about the living in polarized times as a Christian. And as a Christian, it's just different from living in polarized times than anything else, because we have such clear instruction, right, in that very passage. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, right? And you think about who is our neighbor today. It's not the people who live next to us. I think in the world we live in today, our neighbors are the people on our social media feeds, right? Our neighbors are the people that the algorithms of technology have divided us up into, and the people whose social media posts we like and we forward and those kinds of things. I think about those as our neighbors. Those are our neighbors. So the people we're not just merely called by our faith, by our tradition, to love our neighbors, but to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. So I think about, as I'm living as a Christian in a time of polarization, I'm thinking about, and this is why I love to teach Sunday school, because you can get very pragmatic, right? You can get very practical about how does this affect in our lives. And I just, again, I offer these to you as a fellow Christian, not as a expert. But think about counteracting whatever time you spend on social media and giving your time and attention to the engines of outrage. Spend an equal amount of time in prayer and reflection. Spend an equal amount of time praying for your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. And I think that we should all seek out our quote-unquote enemies and try to talk with them face to face. That's what we were trying to do in that class in the fall, right? To sit down with people who disagree with us and to have real life interactions with them. And of course, being in a room with someone is so different from being online with someone. And that was what was one of the powerful examples of this past fall, is when you're in a room with someone who disagrees with you and you give them the respect of listening to them without interrupting them, that's a really powerful thing to do. And it's an important thing for us to do. And then I think also, like, one of the things I'm thinking about too is all of this tied up. When I come back to this textbook chapter in 3 years, I want to write about community and the kind of broad social collapse that we all have of trust and faith in institutions. And this has gone in parallel in the last 30 years with the rise of polarization, that we just had a collapse, the faith in the church, faith in government. I mean, nobody has any faith in Congress. But you can look at this, public trust in institutions, and it's all collapsed across the board in the last 30 or 40 years. And it is part of what contributes to this epidemic of loneliness that people write a lot about today. And kudos to all of you for rejecting the epidemic, for exercising the antidote to loneliness and getting up on a snowy Sunday morning and coming to this beautiful, cherished community. But we all need, I think, to commit to more community as a kind of antidote to loneliness and isolation. And maybe we even need to invite a friend to community, invite somebody to church. I hear you talk about that sometimes. I think that would be a good antidote to community. Antidote to this kind of isolation, because there are a lot of people who are very isolated and very alone. In some ways, not because of their own doing, but because of these broader social forces and cultural trends that make up the water that we swim in and that are just part of the world we're living in today. So those are my 3 Sunday school prescriptions, and take them, they're free advice, so take them for what they're worth. And we'll have maybe 6 minutes for questions? Okay. Thank you.
So I love the expert historian that's also an amazing theologian that teaches us that we are all theologians. Those were really beautiful insights on the Sermon on the Mount that I'm going to take with me. We are going to use the mic because we also have people joining us on live stream. So please just raise your hand, maybe say your name if you have a comment or a question.
Good morning. When I was a history major at Emory, it wouldn't have been any problem finding conservatives back in the 1960s.
Yeah.
The whole university has flipped from when I was there. Yeah. My question really is related to textbooks and writing textbooks nowadays, with the pressure from citizens groups to monitor and to perhaps ban some textbooks if they don't like it. Has the writing that's in it, as your group in doing this textbook, have you had to have some conversation about where to go with that and how to be receptive for that and how to be aware of that? Question, excuse me.
That's a great question. And the writing textbook market is vast, right? Particularly when you think about middle school, high school, college, and all the rest. And you think about individual states having requirements for students to teach certain history. So this textbook is a successful textbook, but it it occupies a very distinct place within that very large market. And so we sell this textbook, Norton sells this textbook mostly to colleges and community colleges. And our big market are the community colleges in Texas, you know. And there are a lot of conservatives in community colleges in Texas, teachers and students. And so part of, my mandate, it's not just, it wasn't a mandate from Norton to write a more conservative account of 21st century history. It was really, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, is to try to try to get beyond a narrative of 21st century history that's just either on one hand a recitation of current events, or on the other hand, just a list of my own political prejudices, and anxieties. But to try to find a kind of perspective that rises above either of those. That was an intellectual challenge to me. And it was also kind of a personal challenge to me. And that's why I wanted to do that. And I think it makes for a better book, too. So that's what I've been trying to do.
Morning. My name is Ryan Carroll. I have a question that kind of comes off of that. Do you see any relationship between Democratic and Republican states in the ranking of education?
Do I see any difference in what kind of ranking of education?
Well, so I just looked on U.S. News, and Florida is number 1, Utah was number 2, Colorado number 3, or Massachusetts number 3. Massachusetts is typically Democratic. Some might
in
argue.
ranking of what, of how well the public students perform?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I'm not sure. Florida was number 1?
That's what it just said, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's surprising. Surprising to you, too, it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that.
Good morning. Thank you. David Ross. In the history of polarization, recent polarization, you see a lot of references to another pretty famous Georgia politician, Newt Gingrich.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little about
Emory graduate.
Newt and his role in this, if there was, what they said?
Yeah. Well, David, this gets into a great, we all know who Newt Gingrich is, former Georgia congressman, Emory graduate, Speaker of the House in the early 1990s. It really when you think about my friend Julian Zelzer, who's a Princeton historian, wrote a biography, Burning Down the House. It was about political biography of Newt Gingrich, and the way that my roommate from graduate school who teaches political science at University of Texas wrote a book called The Gingrich Senators. Sean Theriault is his name, which is about how there were a wave of House Republicans who came into the Senate and brought kind of Gingrich's more confrontational, bomb throwing tactics to the Senate, and it transformed the culture of the Senate. So there is a whole strain of good historical scholarship, political science scholarship, about how this one particular individual, right, who pushed the boundaries of political norms and created this more confrontational style within Washington politics. But always as a historian, you're trying to judge between the role that individuals play versus the role that large social, cultural, broader, technology, things like that play. And so, it always leads you into this debate about if Newt Gingrich had never lived, would there have been some other person who did the same things? Was Gingrich merely responding to the water in which he was swimming, or did he actually change the temperature himself individually? And I think those are the kinds of things that one thinks about in terms of Gingrich's influence on current American politics. But certainly he was a key figure in bringing this more confrontational tack to Washington, to politics in Washington.
Our time is unfortunately up. This is such a great conversation. Let's thank Joe one more time.
Thanks so much.